They were not like other soldiers. When Allied troops first came face to face with an SS battalion during the Second World War, they immediately understood one thing. This enemy would not surrender. These men did not retreat. They did not ask for mercy. They fought until their ammunition was gone, and even then, many continued the fight with knives, fists, or sheer desperation. From the very beginning, the Waffen SS had built a reputation not merely as elite soldiers, but as fanatics who viewed death as preferable to capture. Across the battlefields of Europe, Allied units quickly learned that fighting the SS meant something different. Encounters were often brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. SS soldiers were known to resist even when surrounded, even when wounded, even when defeat was certain. Surrender, in their worldview, was not an option. This mindset alone made them exceptionally dangerous. But there was more. As the war progressed, stories began circulating among Allied troops. Stories of mass executions, stories of burned villages, stories of concentration camps hidden behind barbed wire and smoke. Slowly at first, then with horrifying clarity, soldiers began to realize that the SS were not simply another military formation. They were ideological warriors, personally loyal to Adolf Hitler, shaped by years of indoctrination that blurred the line between soldier and executioner. The Schutzstaffel, commonly known as the SS, had grown into one of the largest paramilitary organizations in history under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. Originally conceived as an elite guard, it evolved into a vast structure with its own command system, intelligence networks, and combat divisions. The Waffen SS became its armed wing, operating alongside the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, but remaining separate in loyalty and purpose. Himmler wanted his men to be seen as the purest embodiment of National Socialist ideology. Unlike the Wehrmacht, whose officers often traced their traditions back generations, the SS owed everything to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Loyalty to the state meant nothing. Loyalty to the Führer meant everything. Over time, what began as a handful of divisions expanded dramatically. From a small corps, the Waffen SS grew into more than 20 divisions, fielding hundreds of thousands of men. These formations fought on every front, from the frozen plains of the East to the hedgerows of Western Europe. Hitler trusted them precisely because they were not bound by conventional military values. They were political soldiers, willing to fight, kill, and die for ideology. Their training reflected this purpose. SS soldiers were not only drilled in weapons and tactics, they were immersed in racial doctrine, taught to see themselves as superior, chosen, and morally justified in acts others might hesitate to commit. Early recruitment focused heavily on men of so-called Aryan descent, reinforcing the myth of racial purity that lay at the core of Nazi belief. Over time, this requirement loosened, but the ideological foundation remained unchanged. On the Eastern Front, SS units became infamous. They fought the Soviet Union with relentless brutality, often showing no mercy to prisoners or civilians. Entire villages were destroyed. Civilians were executed in reprisals. Women were assaulted. Children were abducted and sent to Germany to be raised as Germans. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a system. By the later stages of the war, many Allied soldiers no longer viewed SS personnel as legitimate combatants. They were seen as criminals wearing uniforms. This perception grew stronger as Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe and began uncovering evidence of industrialized murder on a scale never imagined. And this is where everything changed. After the invasions in Western Europe, especially following the landings in Normandy, the rules of engagement grew darker. SS units continued to fight with fanaticism, often pretending to surrender only to attack again when Allied troops lowered their weapons. Some Allied soldiers paid for mercy with their lives. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Taking SS prisoners could be deadly. If you are watching this now and want to understand how ideology reshaped warfare, loyalty, and morality during the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe. This story reveals not just what happened on the battlefield, but why the lines between justice and vengeance began to blur. As reports of concentration camps filtered back to the front lines, anger turned into something more dangerous. Soldiers who liberated camps like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen would later describe scenes so horrifying they defied comprehension. Stacks of corpses, starving prisoners barely clinging to life, evidence of systematic murder carried out with chilling efficiency. For many Allied troops, the SS uniform became a symbol of all they had seen and all they could not forget. Officially, there was no Allied policy ordering the execution of SS prisoners. International law remained clear. Prisoners of war were to be treated humanely. But war is not fought in courtrooms. It is fought by exhausted men under fire, shaped by fear, rage, and survival instinct. On the battlefield, especially in the final months of the war, discipline began to fracture. Combat against SS units was often close, desperate, and chaotic. Front lines shifted constantly. Transporting prisoners through unstable territory posed enormous risks. In such conditions, decisions were made in seconds, not deliberated in principle. Many SS soldiers were killed after surrendering. Some were shot during capture. Others disappeared without record. These acts were illegal. They were war crimes. But they didn't emerge from nothing. They were born from a conflict in which the SS had already erased the expectation of mercy. To Allied soldiers, SS officers in particular represented the ideological core of the Nazi system. They were seen not as ordinary fighters, but as men who had willingly enforced terror, murder, and mass suffering across Europe. By the end of the war, wearing SS insignia could mean the difference between life and death. And this raises a disturbing question. When an enemy rejects the rules of war, what happens to those rules themselves? In the next part of this story, we will explore how battlefield massacres, revenge killings, and moral collapse fed into one another, and why the end of the war did not bring clarity, but judgment. The war was entering its final, desperate months, and the shadows of the SS loomed larger than ever. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of fighting, now faced not only enemy soldiers, but the embodiment of a murderous ideology. Every encounter with SS units carried the weight of fear, suspicion, and vengeance. The uniform alone was enough to spark dread. Men who had survived artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and frozen wastelands now confronted the SS, the people who had executed civilians, terrorized towns, and turned Europe into a landscape of death. To Allied troops, these soldiers were not merely combatants, they were symbols of everything they had witnessed and everything they had lost. The Eastern Front had produced a generation of SS soldiers conditioned to brutality. They had been trained, indoctrinated, and tested in the most extreme circumstances. Young men, some barely out of adolescence, had been molded into killers who viewed mercy as weakness. Officers and enlisted men alike were taught to see loyalty to Hitler above life itself, and the ideology that had shaped them made them fear nothing and no one. When they were captured, the natural order of war seemed to collapse. Prisoners who would have been processed elsewhere became dangerous, unpredictable, and in the eyes of the soldiers on the ground, a threat that demanded immediate action. Stories filtered back from the front lines and the liberated concentration camps, tales too horrifying to ignore. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, names that would forever haunt history, became synonymous with the SS's capacity for systematic cruelty. Starving survivors, piles of corpses, evidence of industrialized murder. It was unimaginable. And wherever the SS had left its mark, revenge followed swiftly. Soldiers who had witnessed these horrors were pushed beyond the rules of law, beyond the protections normally granted to prisoners of war. The uniform itself became a target, a signal that the wearer was guilty before trial, a living reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of ideology. Combat in these closing months was close, chaotic, and relentless. Fronts shifted rapidly, lines collapsed, and prisoners were often caught in the crossfire. Decisions had to be made instantly. Life and death were measured in seconds. Many SS soldiers met their end during capture, while others simply vanished in the confusion. Each incident, whether intended or accidental, reflected the breakdown of conventional warfare, where human emotion and moral judgment collided with sheer survival instinct. The law of armed conflict, clear on paper, became nearly meaningless on the battlefield. Yet even in these brutal circumstances, the reasons behind the actions of Allied soldiers were understandable. The SS were not ordinary enemies. They were ideological warriors, fanatics who had orchestrated terror across an entire continent. They had executed civilians, assassinated partisans, and enforced Hitler's policies with uncompromising rigor. The hatred that Allied soldiers felt was not born of cruelty alone. It was the natural response of men confronted with a system that had weaponized ideology itself. In that environment, the lines between justice, revenge, and survival blurred. By the end of the war, every SS insignia carried the weight of guilt. Even surrendering did not guarantee life. For many soldiers, encountering an SS officer was not a chance to take a prisoner. It was a confrontation with a living embodiment of evil. And in the chaos of battle, ideology often dictated fate faster than law could intervene. The end of the war revealed the complex moral calculus that soldiers had to navigate. When faced with an enemy that rejected the rules of war entirely, how could the rules themselves survive? If you've watched this far, you now understand the intensity of this moral and physical battlefield. The SS were not simply soldiers. They were a living, breathing challenge to justice, law, and humanity. And their legacy forced Allied soldiers into decisions that history still struggles to judge. If you want to explore more stories like this, to see how ideology, warfare, and human choices intertwined in the most extreme circumstances of history, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and comment below. Every story we share brings you closer to understanding the extraordinary, often terrifying human experience behind the headlines of the Second World War.